Story 1. Gary James Johnson was born on October 17, 1950, in St. Louis, Missouri. He was a white male. His family lived in the St. Louis area, and he grew up there with several brothers. His brothers' names were Tracy, Randy, Ricky, and Terry. Terry was his older brother. Gary went to school like other children, but he did not finish high school. He only completed 8 years of education. After he left school, he did not get a skilled job. He worked as a laborer. This meant he did physical work for money. He worked with his hands and did jobs that did not require special training. For most of his life, Gary did not have a criminal record. He was not known as a violent person. He had never been to prison before the events that came later. He had a wife at one time, and they had a daughter together. His ex-wife later said that Gary was never violent toward their children. She also said that he never drank alcohol and never used drugs. Gary worked at different jobs over the years. At one point, he worked as a ranch hand at a place called the Triple Creek Ranch. This was a large piece of land used for raising animals. His job was to help take care of the ranch. He did tasks like fixing fences and looking after the property. He worked there for a period of time, and he learned the layout of the land. His former boss and a coworker later said that Gary was hardworking, respectful, and not violent. They had no bad things to say about his behavior at work. There were some things in Gary's past that stood out. In 1972, he shot and killed a neighbor's dog. He fired a gun from a distance of 75 to 100 yards. The dog was standing only a few feet away from its owner at the time. Gary later paid $150 to the dog's owner as restitution. That meant he gave money to make up for what he had done. This was the only known violent act in his past involving an animal or a person. Gary had a phrase that he liked to use. His brother Terry later said that Gary's favorite expression was "kill them all, let God sort them out." This phrase was also found etched into the concrete outside Gary's home. It was also on a t-shirt that he wore in a photograph. People who knew him noticed this, but they did not think much of it at the time. Gary owned a truck. The truck had a special feature on the back. It had 4 large round brake lights. There were 2 lights on each side of the truck. One light was above the other on each side. This was not a common design, so the truck stood out. Gary used this truck for his daily activities. Gary moved to Texas at some point. He lived in a trailer house in the Huntsville area. He continued to work as a laborer and did not have a steady career. He kept to himself and spent time with his family and friends. He had no serious problems with the law. He lived a quiet life without any major troubles. His brothers stayed in Missouri. They would visit each other from time to time. Gary would sometimes go back to Missouri to see them. His relationships with his brothers were normal. They talked and spent time together like most families do. By the time Gary was in his mid-30s, he had settled into a routine. He worked, he took care of his truck, and he stayed in touch with his family. He did not have a plan to do anything illegal. He had no history of burglary or theft. He simply lived day by day. He had a daughter, a brother nearby, and friends who cared about him. His life seemed ordinary. That was how Gary James Johnson lived before the events that would change everything. On the evening of April 30th, 1986, Gary James Johnson and his older brother, Terry, made a decision to commit a burglary. They drove to the Triple Creek Ranch, which was located about 10 miles west of Huntsville, Texas. Gary knew this property well because he had worked there before. He knew where things were kept and how to move around the land without being easily seen. The brothers went to the ranch to steal specific items. They wanted a welder, tires, livestock feed, and other things they could take and sell or use. They drove Gary's truck to a gate on the side of the ranch that faced a road called Highway 30. When they arrived, Gary cut the chain that held the gate closed. Then he put a new lock on the gate. This was a trick. By replacing the lock, they made it harder for anyone to follow them through that same gate. They turned off the truck's headlights so they would not be seen from a distance. Then Gary drove the truck through the gate and onto the ranch property. While the brothers were looking around for items to steal, two men arrived at the ranch. The first man was James Matthew Hazelton. He was 28 years old and worked as the ranch foreman. That meant he was in charge of the ranch and its daily operations. The second man was Peter Joseph Sparagana. He was 23 years old and was Hazelton's brother-in-law. The two men had come to the ranch because a neighbor had called them. The neighbor had seen the truck enter the ranch with its lights off and thought a burglary might be happening. Hazelton and Sparagana drove to the gate, but they could not open it because the lock had been changed. So Hazelton backed up his truck and entered the ranch from a different location. They drove around until they found Terry Johnson. They saw Terry and confronted him. They did not see Gary because Gary was hiding nearby. While Terry spoke to the two men and distracted them, Gary stayed out of sight and waited for his chance. Gary came out of hiding and fired his gun. He used a .44 caliber pistol. He shot Peter Sparagana first. Sparagana was hit by the bullets and fell to the ground. He died from the gunshot wounds. The shots were fired at close range. James Hazelton saw what happened and tried to run away from the scene. He ran as fast as he could, but Gary caught up with him. Gary and his brother Terry took Hazelton back to a barn on the property. They made Hazelton get down on his knees. Then they tied his hands behind his back so he could not move or defend himself. Hazelton knew he was in grave danger. He began to plead for his life. He begged Gary not to kill him, but Gary did not listen. Gary walked up to Hazelton, placed the barrel of the .44 caliber pistol inside Hazelton's mouth, and pulled the trigger. Hazelton died instantly from the contact wound to his mouth. Both victims were shot multiple times. Medical examination later showed that Hazelton had been shot at least 3 times, including the fatal shot to his mouth. During the shooting, neighbors Bill and Shannon Ferguson were in a nearby pasture. They heard the first gunshot. Then they heard several more shots fired in quick succession. After a short silence, they heard a man's voice pleading for his life. They could not see what was happening, but they could hear the pleas. Then they heard 2 more gunshots, and the pleas stopped. Mrs. Ferguson had already called the police after the first shot. After both men were dead, Gary and Terry left the ranch. They did not take the items they had come to steal. They simply fled the scene in Gary's truck. In the 2 weeks that followed the murders, Gary removed 2 of the 4 round brake lights from the back of his truck. He did this so the truck would no longer match the description that the neighbors had seen. Several months after the murders, Gary traveled to Missouri to visit his brothers. He brought the .44 caliber pistol with him. He gave the gun to his brother Tracy and told Tracy to destroy it. Gary explained that the pistol had been used in a double murder in Texas. He also told his brother Ricky that he had killed 1 man with that gun, and that he and Terry had killed a second man. Gary explained to his brother Randy exactly what had happened at the ranch. He said that he and Terry had gone there to steal things. When the 2 men showed up, Terry distracted them while Gary shot one. Then they caught the other man, brought him to the barn, made him kneel, tied his hands, and Gary put the gun in his mouth and fired. When Randy asked why he had killed the 2 men, Gary gave a simple answer. He said, "Dead men don't talk." That was his reason. The brothers in Missouri listened to Gary's confession. They did not go to the police right away. Gary left the gun with Tracy and returned to Texas. He continued his daily life. He drove his truck with the missing lights. He stayed in his trailer. He did not tell anyone else about what he had done. For nearly 2 years, the crime remained unsolved. The bodies had been found, but no one had been arrested. The police had some clues, but they had not yet connected everything to Gary. That was the situation. Gary Johnson had committed the murders. He had confessed to his brothers. He had given away the murder weapon. He had changed the appearance of his truck, but he was still a free man, going about his ordinary routine, with no one knocking on his door. On the night of the murders, Bill and Shannon Ferguson had been in their pasture. They had seen a truck pull over near the gate and someone go through onto the ranch. Mrs. Ferguson noticed the truck had an unusual brake light pattern. For large round lights, two on each side, one above the other. She called the ranch and told the manager's wife. Later, after hearing the shots, she called the police. When law enforcement arrived, they found the bodies of Hazelton and Sparagana. The investigation began that night, but the case was not solved quickly. The Fergusons gave a detailed description of the truck to the police. Mrs. Ferguson described the 4 round lights in the back. The police put out a "Be on the lookout" alert for a truck matching that description. Later that same night or early the next morning, a constable told a deputy that Gary Johnson drove a truck with exactly that kind of light pattern. Deputy Alan McCandles saw a truck matching the description in Gary Johnson's pasture after the shootings. He also saw Gary driving that truck many times. In the 2 weeks after the murders, someone removed 2 of the 4 round lights from the back of Gary's truck. This was noticed by law enforcement. The truck no longer matched the description as closely. However, the police already had enough information to consider Gary a suspect. They also knew that Gary had once worked at the ranch and knew the property well. It took nearly 2 years for the police to build their case. They gathered evidence and interviewed witnesses. On May 20th, 1988, Terry Johnson was arrested. That same day, he gave a written statement to police. In that statement, he said that Gary had shot both victims. On June 23, 1988, Terry spoke to Gary's lawyer and repeated the same story. Terry then made a deal with the prosecutors. He agreed to plead guilty to murder and testify against Gary. In exchange, the state would not seek the death penalty for Terry. He would receive a prison sentence of 99 years. Terry accepted this deal to save his own life. On June 23, 1988, a grand jury in Walker County indicted Gary Johnson for capital murder. That meant he was formally charged with the crime. Gary was arrested and taken into custody. He had no prior felony convictions, but he was now facing the most serious charge possible. The trial began in August 1988. During the trial, the prosecution called 3 of Gary's brothers to the witness stand: Tracy, Randy, and Ricky. They testified about what Gary had told them in Missouri after the murders. They described how Gary had brought the .44 caliber pistol to them and had admitted to the killings. A state firearms examiner testified that a bullet fragment taken from Hazelton's body had been fired from that same .44 caliber pistol. The medical examiner testified that Hazelton died from a contact wound to the mouth, meaning the gun was pressed against his skin when it was fired. The defense called Terry Johnson as a witness. Terry testified that Gary had done the shooting. The defense also presented 2 other witnesses who said that Terry had told them he was the one who killed both victims. The defense tried to show that Terry was not credible and that he had made a deal to save himself. The jury found Gary Johnson guilty of capital murder on August 19, 1988. The next phase of the trial was the punishment phase. The jury had to decide whether Gary should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. To sentence him to death, the jury had to find that Gary would be a future danger to society and that he had acted deliberately. During this phase, the prosecution presented evidence about the dog shooting from 1972. They also showed that Gary was carrying a loaded handgun when he was arrested. A psychiatrist named Dr. James Grigson testified for the state. He was known as Dr. Death because he often testified in death penalty cases. Based on a summary of Gary's behavior, Dr. Grigson said that Gary would almost certainly commit future acts of violence. The defense presented its own witnesses. Gary's uncle said he had never seen Gary act violently. His former boss and coworker said Gary was hardworking and respectful. His ex-wife said he was never violent to their children and did not use drugs or alcohol. A psychologist and a criminologist also testified that predicting future dangerousness was unreliable. The jury deliberated for about 35 minutes. They found that Gary had acted deliberately and that he would be a future danger to society. The judge sentenced Gary James Johnson to death on August 19, 1988. Terry Johnson, who had testified against his brother, was sentenced to 99 years in prison as part of his plea deal. Gary appealed his conviction. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the case and affirmed the conviction and death sentence on December 16, 1992. Gary then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case. The Supreme Court denied his request on October 4, 1993. Over the following years, Gary filed more appeals. On August 30, 1996, he filed a state habeas corpus petition, which was a request to have his conviction reviewed for errors. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied that petition on October 20, 2004. On October 19, 2005, Gary filed a federal habeas corpus petition in a United States District Court in Houston. The District Court denied relief on September 28, 2007. Gary appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. On January 7, 2009, the Fifth Circuit affirmed the denial of relief. Gary then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case again. The Supreme Court denied his petition on October 5, 2009. With all appeals exhausted, the trial court set an execution date for January 12, 2010. On that day, Gary's lawyers made one final request to the Supreme Court to stay the execution. They argued that Gary was nearly blind, in poor health, and no longer posed a danger to anyone. The Supreme Court rejected this plea. On January 12, 2010, at 6:15 p.m., Gary James Johnson was taken to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. He was given a lethal injection. Before the drugs were administered, the warden asked if he wanted to make a final statement. At first, he declined. Then he said, "Tell my family goodbye." He continued speaking. His voice was filled with emotion. He said, "You tell the rest of them what they did was wrong for letting me take the fall for what they did. I never done anything in my life to anybody." Those were his final words. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Gary James Johnson was 59 years old. He was the second person executed in Texas in 2010 and the 449th person executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His brother Terry Johnson remained in prison serving his 99-year sentence. James Hazelton and Peter Sparagana were buried by their families. The case was finally closed. Story 2. Julius Ricardo Young was born on February 17, 1949 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He grew up in that city and lived there for his entire life. His mother was Aileen Young, and his father was Cornelius Young too. Julius had two brothers. One brother was named Terry, and the other was named Cornelius Young III. The family was close, and they all lived in the Tulsa area. Julius came from a family that valued religion. His great-grandfather was a minister named Reverend McDaniels. Julius looked up to his great-grandfather and admired him. Because of this influence, Julius later decided to become a minister himself. He became an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He served as a pastor at a church in Boynton, Oklahoma, and he also preached regularly at AME churches in Tulsa. He remained a minister for 11 years before his arrest. As a child and young man, Julius was known for having a mild personality. People who knew him described him as withdrawn and quiet, but always courteous. He was polite and did what was asked of him. He was not known to be violent or aggressive. His family and friends saw him as a gentle person who tried to help others. Julius attended school in Tulsa. After finishing his education, he joined the United States Army. He served in the Army and was given an honorable discharge when his service ended. After leaving the military, he returned to Tulsa and found work. At one point, he worked as a youth guidance specialist, where he helped young people. Later, he worked as a houseman at a place called the Holiday Dome in Tulsa. In 1990, while he was cleaning the swimming pool there, he saw a mother and her child in danger in the water. He rescued them both. The mother offered him a monetary reward for saving them, but Julius refused to accept the money. This action showed that he was willing to help others without expecting anything in return. Julius married and had children. He had at least 2 sons, whose names were Derek and Julius Jr. The marriage later ended in divorce, but Julius remained active in his sons' lives. He coached their t-ball teams and served as a Cub Scout leader. He took his sons fishing on weekends, which was one of their favorite activities together. He was strict about their schoolwork and expected them to do well. He also helped his own parents by doing lawn work and handyman jobs around their house. He was particularly close to his mother, Aileen, and he lived with her in his adult years. His mother was described as a strong-willed woman who made many of the family decisions, and Julius usually went along with what she decided. Julius also experienced deep personal losses during his life. His younger brother, Terry, died of sickle cell anemia. This death was devastating to Julius and his family. Later, one of Julius's own young sons, named Dominique, also died of sickle cell anemia. At Dominique's funeral, Julius became extremely emotional. He cried hysterically and tried to grab the casket. These 2 losses, along with the deaths of his maternal grandparents during a 7-year period, caused Julius great emotional pain. He struggled to process these tragedies. To cope with his emotional distress, Julius sometimes drank alcohol. When he drank, his personality could change. People noticed that he became snappy and had an attitude when he had been drinking. However, he was not known to be physically violent toward others during these times. He simply became more irritable. Julius also had relationships with women. At one point, he became involved with a woman named Joycelyn Edwards. They dated for a period of time. Joycelyn had a daughter named Joylyn Morgan and a grandson named Kewan Morgan. Julius became part of their extended circle because of his relationship with Joycelyn. However, not everyone in Joycelyn's family liked Julius. Her daughter Joylyn and her grandson Kewan did not feel comfortable around him. Because of this, Joycelyn made some changes in her living arrangements to make her family feel safe. She decided to move to a new apartment. She told Julius that he would not get a key to her new apartment. This decision was made because she wanted her daughter and grandson to feel secure when they visited her. The night before the events that would later change everything, Joycelyn had a conversation with Julius about their relationship. She told him that she wanted to cool their relationship, meaning she wanted to take a step back from dating him. She also asked him to return the key he had to the apartment where she used to live, which was the apartment that her daughter Joylyn and grandson Kewan now lived in. Julius did not give the key back. At that point, Julius was living with his mother. He continued his daily routines. He still drove Joycelyn to work every morning, as he had done before. On the morning of October 1st, 1993, he arrived to pick her up earlier than usual. That day, she asked him for change so she could use the vending machines at work. When Julius pulled the contents from his pocket, Joycelyn noticed a small piece of a broken security chain. She recognized the type of chain because she had recently installed one on her daughter's door. She thought it was strange, but she did not say anything to him at that time. Later that same day, Joycelyn learned something terrible had happened at her daughter's apartment. On October 1st, 1993, Joycelyn Edwards went to work as usual after Julius drove her there. Later that day, she received news that something horrible had happened at the apartment where her daughter Joylyn Morgan and her 6-year-old grandson Kewan lived. The apartment was located at 115 East 16th Street in Tulsa. When people went to check on them, they found that Joyland and Kewen were both dead inside the apartment. The police were called immediately. The police arrived and examined the apartment carefully. The front door had 2 locks and a security chain. Every night before she went to bed, Joyland would secure the door with both locks and the chain. On the morning of October 1st, the police found that both locks had been opened with a key. The security chain had been broken. It had been pushed through with enough force to snap it. A small piece of the broken chain was missing from the apartment. This meant that whoever entered the apartment had a key to open the locks, and then forced the door open by breaking the chain. Inside the apartment, the police found the bodies of Joyland and Kewen in separate rooms. Joyland Morgan was 20 years old. She was found slumped against a wall in the living room. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms. This showed that she had tried to protect herself from the attack. She had also received at least 13 blows to her face and head. These blows broke her jaw, tore open her scalp, and fractured her skull. The medical examiner later determined that she had been conscious during the attack and had suffered serious physical abuse before she died. Kewen Morgan was only 6 years old. He was found in his bed. He had suffered massive fractures to his head caused by 2 separate blows. He died in his bed from these injuries. The medical examiner stated that the wounds on both victims were caused by a blunt instrument similar to a baseball bat. However, the murder weapon was never found at the scene or anywhere else. The police spoke to neighbors in the apartment building. One neighbor who lived downstairs reported that she had been awakened at about 3:40 a.m. that morning by a single loud bump coming from the Morgan apartment. She did not hear anything else after that, so she went back to sleep. This gave the police a rough time frame for when the attack occurred. The police then began to look for suspects. Because the locks had been opened with a key, they focused on people who had a key to that apartment. Joycelyn Edwards told the police that Julius had a key to the apartment. She also told them that she had asked him to return the key the day before the murders, but he had not given it back. She also explained that Julius had been her boyfriend, but she had recently told him she wanted to cool their relationship. Joycelyn provided more important information. She told the police that on the night before the murders, she had seen a baseball bat in the trunk of Julius's car. The next day, which was the day of the murders, the bat was gone from the trunk. She also told them about the morning of October 1st. She said that Julius had arrived to pick her up for work at 4:15 a.m., which was earlier than his usual time. When she asked him for change, he pulled out the contents of his pocket, and she saw a small piece of a broken security chain. The chain looked exactly like the type she had recently installed on her daughter's apartment door. She did not confront him about it at the time, but after she learned about the murders, she reported everything to the police. The police also learned that Julius had changed his clothes that morning. He had gone to his mother's house after the murders and changed his outfit. Joycelyn told the police what Julius had been wearing the night before, which was a pink dress shirt, black slacks, and brown or black shoes with tassels. Based on all this information, the police obtained a search warrant for the home where Julius lived with his mother, Aileen Young. They executed the search warrant on the evening of October 1st at about 8:15 p.m. During the search, Julius was present and he accompanied the officers. The police found the shoes that Joycelyn had described. On one of the shoes, there was a visible spot of blood. When the police saw the blood, Julius spoke up without being asked. He volunteered that the spot was fish blood. He said this to explain why the blood was there. The police collected the shoes as evidence. The police also found a freshly laundered shirt during the search. When they applied a chemical called luminol to the shirt, it tested positive for blood. Luminol reacts with the iron found in blood, so this indicated that blood had been on the shirt even though it had been washed. The police collected the shirt as well. At that point, The police had gathered physical evidence, including the shoes with the blood spot and the shirt that tested positive for blood. They also had Joyceland's statements about the key, the baseball bat, the broken chain in Julius's pocket, and his early arrival that morning. The neighbor's testimony about the loud bump at 3:40 a.m. also supported the timeline. All of this evidence pointed toward Julius as the person who had entered the apartment, used his key to open the locks, forced the chain open, and then attacked Joyland and Kewen with a blunt instrument like a baseball bat. However, the police did not make an immediate arrest that night. They needed more confirmation. They sent the blood samples from the shoes to a laboratory for DNA testing. They also continued to gather additional information. The case was still being built, and the full investigation had only just begun. The evidence collected during the search would later become central to the case, but at this moment, the police were still in the early stages of processing what they had found. After the search of Julius's home, the police sent the blood-stained shoes to a laboratory for DNA testing. The results came back and showed that the blood on the shoe was human blood. Further testing confirmed that the DNA from that blood was consistent with the DNA of both Joyland Morgan and Kewen Morgan. This meant that Julius had blood from both victims on his shoe. The police also had the shirt that tested positive for blood when exposed to luminol. With this physical evidence, combined with Joycelyn Edwards' statements about the key, the missing baseball bat, the broken chain in Julius's pocket, and his early arrival on the morning of the murders, the police had enough evidence to make an arrest. On February 22, 1994, Julius Ricardo Young was formally charged by the state of Oklahoma. The charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Joyland Morgan and one for Kewen Morgan. He was also charged with 1 count of first-degree burglary because he had entered the apartment unlawfully with the intent to commit a crime. Julius was taken into custody and held in jail while he waited for his trial. The trial began in September 1995. The prosecution presented its case to the jury over several days. They called witnesses including Joycelyn Edwards, who testified about the key, the baseball bat she had seen in Julius's trunk, the broken chain she saw in his pocket, and his early arrival that morning. The downstairs neighbor testified about hearing a loud bump at 3:40 a.m. The police officers testified about the search of Julius's home and the items they recovered. The forensic expert testified about the DNA testing and explained that the blood on Julius's shoe matched both victims. The medical examiner testified about the injuries to Joyland and Kewen, describing the defensive wounds on Joyland's hands and arms and the multiple blows to both victims' heads. Julius's defense attorney tried to challenge the evidence. He argued that the DNA testing method used was not fully reliable and that the blood evidence had been mishandled. He also pointed out that the murder weapon, the baseball bat, was never found. However, the prosecution presented a strong case with physical evidence, witness testimony, and a clear timeline. The jury listened to all the evidence and then deliberated. At the conclusion of the first phase of the trial, the jury found Julius guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree burglary. The trial then moved to the second phase, where the jury would decide whether Julius should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution presented evidence of aggravating circumstances. These were factors that made the crimes more severe. The prosecution argued that Julius had created a great risk of death to more than one person, that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and that Julius posed a continuing threat to society. The prosecution also presented victim impact testimony from a relative of Joyland and Kewen, who described the loss felt by the family. Julius's defense attorney did not call live witnesses to testify in this phase. Instead, he entered a written stipulation, which is an agreed statement of facts. The stipulation stated that Julius was 42 years old, had been a lifelong resident of Tulsa, had family who loved him, had been a minister for 11 years and was an honorably discharged Army veteran. The defense then asked the jury to show mercy and spared Julius's life. The jury considered the aggravating circumstances and the mitigating evidence. They found that the prosecution had proven 3 aggravating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. They then weighed these aggravating factors against the mitigating evidence. After their deliberations, the jury recommended the death penalty for both murder convictions. For the burglary conviction, they recommended 50 years in prison. The judge formally sentenced Julius to death on October 4, 1995. After the trial, Julius began the appeals process. His case was automatically reviewed by the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. In 1998, that court issued its decision. The court found that some errors had occurred during the trial. For example, the court noted that the jury had been allowed to consider some aggravating circumstances that had not been properly noticed for both murder counts. The court also struck the continuing threat aggravator because there was not enough evidence to support it. However, after reweighing the remaining valid aggravators against the mitigating evidence, the court determined that the death sentences were still justified and affirmed the convictions and sentences. Julius then filed for federal habeas corpus relief, which is a way for state prisoners to challenge their convictions in federal court. The federal district court denied his petition. He appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2008, the 10th Circuit issued a ruling. The court agreed that Julius's trial attorney had performed deficiently by failing to investigate and present more mitigating evidence, such as testimony from family members and psychological experts. However, the court concluded that Julius had not been prejudiced by this failure. The court reasoned that even with the additional mitigating evidence, the jury would still have found the aggravating circumstances and would still have sentenced him to death. The court affirmed the lower court's denial of relief. Julius continued to fight his case. He asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case, but the Supreme Court denied his petition on October 5, 2009. This meant that all of his appeals were exhausted, and he had no more legal options to stop the execution. With the appeals exhausted, the state of Oklahoma set an execution date for January 14, 2010. Before the execution, Julius had one final chance to seek clemency from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. At a hearing in December 2009, Julius spoke to the board by video link. He told them, "I cannot confess to something I did not do. I am an innocent man." His mother also made an emotional plea, asking the board to spare her son's life. The board listened to both sides, but they voted 4-1 to deny clemency. The execution would proceed as scheduled. On the day of the execution, January 14, 2010, Julius was taken to the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was given a final meal of his choice, which consisted of a sirloin steak, a baked potato, onion rings, a tossed salad, and a Coke. Members of the victim's family and Julius's own family were present in separate viewing rooms. Julius's mother, Aileen, sat behind the glass and sobbed. Before the lethal drugs were administered, Julius gave his final words. He said, "I am an innocent man. This is a miscarriage of justice. I didn't take the lives of Joylyn Morgan and her son Kewen. My attorney failed me. It's a tragedy. I'm an innocent man. To my family, I love you." The lethal injection began at 6:21 p.m. The drugs flowed into his body. Julius took a few last gasps of air and then fell silent. At 6:27 p.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 60 years old. After the execution, Dion Morgan, who was Joylyn's brother, spoke to reporters. He described the life that 6-year-old Kewen never got to live. He said Kewen never got to ride a bicycle, drive a car, swim, or have a family pet. He said justice had been served. Joycelyn Edwards, who had once been Julius's girlfriend, and who was the mother of Joyland and grandmother of Kewen, said she would never bring the case up again. She said it would be a closed book in her life. Julius's mother, Aileen, continued to believe that her son was innocent. She said his trial had not been fair. The case of Julius Ricardo Young came to a final end on that day in January 2010. He was buried, and the legal proceedings were over. The two victims, Joyland and Kewen Morgan, had been dead for more than 16 years, and their killer had finally been held accountable by the state. The story of this crime, from Julius's early life to the brutal murders and through the long years of appeals, concluded with his execution, leaving behind two families forever changed by the events that began on October 1st, 1993. Story 3. Mark Aaron Brown was born on November 13, 1972. His mother was Betty Brown. His father was not married to Betty, and he was not part of Mark's life. From the very beginning, Mark grew up without a father. He never had a father figure to guide him or care for him. Betty Brown had serious problems with drugs and alcohol. She used heroin during the first 3 months of her pregnancy with Mark. She also smoked marijuana every single day while she was pregnant. This meant that Mark was exposed to drugs before he was even born. When Mark was born, his mother continued to use drugs and drink alcohol. She did not hide this. She did these things openly in the home where Mark and his siblings lived. Mark had 2 older siblings. His mother often left the 3 children alone for long periods of time. She did not take good care of them. Sometimes she left them with other people, like relatives or friends. Other times she just left them by themselves. Mark and his siblings had to learn to take care of themselves because their mother was not there for them. They did not have a stable or safe home environment. When Mark was a young child, there was an accident in the apartment. He was left alone at the time. He tried to cook something and started a fire. He was just a child, and he did not mean to cause any harm. But this shows that he was often left without adult supervision. He had to do things that children should not have to do on their own. Mark's mother moved the family from place to place. They did not stay in one home for very long. Betty would leave her children with different people. Sometimes Mark lived with an aunt or an uncle in Youngstown, Ohio. For a period of time, he lived with his mother in Los Angeles, California. But then he returned to Youngstown without her. He went back to live with relatives again. This happened more than once. He was always moving and never had a stable place to call home. When Mark was 6 years old, something terrible happened to him. He was sexually abused. This was a traumatic event in his young life. He did not have anyone to protect him or help him deal with what had happened. He carried this pain with him as he grew older. By the time Mark was 10 or 11 years old, he started using alcohol and marijuana. He was still just a child, but he was already turning to drugs and alcohol. This was partly because he was surrounded by drug and alcohol abuse in his home. His mother used drugs and alcohol openly, so he saw it as normal. He also used these substances to cope with his difficult life and the pain he felt inside. Mark did not have a stable or nurturing childhood. He was neglected by his mother. She often left him and his siblings alone. She was a heavy drug user and did not provide proper care. Mark grew up in an unstable environment. There was very little love, support, or guidance in his home. He had to fend for himself most of the time. When Mark was a child living in California, he became involved with a gang. He was a member of the Baby Crips. This was a group of young people who were part of a larger gang. He joined this gang when he was young. This shows that he was already getting into trouble and associating with people who were involved in criminal activity. Mark went to school, but he did not finish. He completed the 10th grade. He could read and write, so he had basic literacy skills. But he did not continue his education beyond that point. He left school and did not get a high school diploma. As Mark became a teenager, his problems with drugs and alcohol got worse. He started using more substances. He used alcohol, marijuana, and sedatives. By the time he was in his late teens, he was addicted to these substances. He could not stop using them. His addiction controlled his life. Mark also became very sexually active around the age of 15. This was another way he tried to cope with his past trauma and his unstable life. He was looking for comfort and connection, but he did not have healthy relationships. Mark had several run-ins with the law as a young man. He had prior felony drug convictions. This means he was found guilty of drug-related crimes before the events that would later change his life forever. He went to jail for these drug offenses. He had experience with the criminal justice system from a young age. Because of his prior convictions, Mark was familiar with police procedures. He had been read his Miranda rights before. He had been represented by lawyers in court. He knew how the system worked. This was not his first time dealing with law enforcement. Mark's family life continued to be difficult. He had a sister named Michelle and a brother. He maintained some contact with his family, but his relationships were not strong or stable. His mother lost contact with him for long periods. She rarely saw him after he was 12 years old. He was often left to survive on his own. Mark had a history of emotional instability. He had difficulty controlling his anger. He had trouble coping with life. He did not trust other people easily. He often felt empty inside. These feelings were made worse by his drug and alcohol abuse. The substances he used intensified his problems and made it harder for him to control his impulses. Mark also had a friend named Alan Thomas, who was called Booney. They spent time together. They both used drugs and alcohol. They were part of the same social circle. They lived in or near the Kimmelbrook housing projects in Youngstown, Ohio. This was a rough neighborhood. It was not a safe or easy place to grow up. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Mark never had a stable home, a loving family, or proper guidance. He was surrounded by drugs, alcohol, neglect, and abuse. He turned to substances to cope with his pain. He got into trouble with the law. He joined a gang. He moved from place to place. He was never able to build a normal or healthy life. By the time Mark was 21 years old, he had already lived through more hardship and trauma than most people experience in a lifetime. He had a long history of drug and alcohol addiction. He had been to jail. He had no stable job, no stable home, and no stable relationships. He was still using drugs and alcohol heavily. He was still hanging around with friends who also used drugs. His life was chaotic and out of control. He was angry, impulsive, and troubled. He did not have the support or the skills to make better choices. On the evening of January 28, 1994, Mark Brown was with his friend Alan Thomas, who was called Booney, and Booney's uncle, Gary Thomas. The three men were in Gary Thomas's car. They drove to a store to buy beer and wine. After buying the alcohol, they went to the home of a relative of Alan Thomas. This house belonged to Lisa Dotson or Kenny Dotson. They went there to play cards and spend time together. When they arrived at the Dotson house, there were other young people there. Some of these young people were Marcus Clark, Mizelle Arrington, and Antwain McMeans. They were all hanging out at the house. The group started playing cards. While they were playing cards, Mark Brown and Alan Thomas began drinking Thunderbird wine. This wine had something extra in it. They had dissolved Valium pills into the wine. Valium is a strong sedative that makes people feel relaxed and less inhibited. In addition to the wine, Mark Brown smoked marijuana. He smoked it in blunts. A blunt is a cigar that has been cut open, emptied of tobacco, and refilled with marijuana. Mark Brown was using both alcohol and drugs that night. During the card game, Mark Brown talked about a movie called Menace to Society. This movie had a scene at the very beginning where two young men go into a convenience store that is run by Asian immigrants. In the movie, the men rob the store and kill the two store clerks. Mark Brown told Alan Thomas that he wanted to do exactly what the characters did in that movie scene. He wanted to copy it. Gary Thomas, who was sitting with them, noticed that Mark Brown had a gun on him while they were playing cards. The gun was a 9mm handgun. Mark Brown had it in his pants or his coat pocket. He did not hide the fact that he had a weapon. After several hours at the Dotson house, the three men left. They drove to the Kimmelbrook housing projects to buy more marijuana. They made that purchase, and then they drove to another store. This store was the Midway Market. It was located at the corner of Elm Street and New York Avenue in Youngstown, Ohio. The Midway Market was a convenience store in a rough neighborhood on the north side of the city. The Salmon family owned the Midway Market. They had owned and operated this store for over 20 years. It was a family business. On the night of January 28, 1994, two people were working in the store. One was Isam Salman. He was the son of the store owner. He was 32 years old, and he had 7 children. The other worker was Haider Alturk. He was an employee who had worked at the store for about 1 year. He was 30 years old. That night, the video surveillance cameras inside the store were not turned on. The cameras were usually used for security. But because a family member was working that night, the cameras were not recording. This meant that there would be no video footage of what was about to happen. When Mark Brown, Alan Thomas, and Gary Thomas arrived at the Midway Market, Gary Thomas stayed in the car. He sat in the vehicle and listened to music. Alan Thomas and Mark Brown went inside the store. They made some purchases. They bought blunt cigars. After buying what they wanted, they came back out to the car. But then Mark Brown said something. He said that he had forgotten to do something. He did not explain what he had forgotten. He then put on a mask or a bandana over his face. He took the 9mm handgun with him. He went back into the store by himself. Some witnesses said that Alan Thomas also went back in briefly, but then came right back out. The key point is that Mark Brown re-entered the store while wearing a mask and carrying a loaded gun. At that same time, some of the young people who had been at the Dotson house were walking to the Midway Market. Marcus Clark and Mizelle Arrington were among them. They arrived at the store just as Mark Brown and Alan Thomas were entering for the first time. These young people were leaving the store when Mark Brown went back in for the second time. Marcus Clark saw Mark Brown put on the mask before he went inside. Once Mark Brown was inside the Midway Market, he confronted Isam Salman and Haider Alturk. He had the gun in his hand. He shot both men multiple times. The shots were fired from the 9mm handgun. Both victims were shot in the head. Isam Salman was kneeling behind the store counter when he was shot. He was trying to hide or protect himself. Haider Alturk was lying on the floor. Both men died from their wounds. They died right there in the store. While the shooting was happening, Gary Thomas was still sitting in the car outside. He heard the gunshots. After a short time, Mark Brown came back out of the store. He walked calmly to the car. He did not seem upset or in a hurry. Gary Thomas asked Mark Brown what the gunshots were about. Mark Brown lied to him. He said, "Oh, that was nothing but some firecrackers." He tried to make it seem like nothing serious had happened. The three men then drove away from the Midway Market. They went back to the Dotson house. When they arrived, Mark Brown started cleaning his gun. He was wiping it off. Other people at the house saw him doing this. They also saw that Mark Brown had blood on his hands and on his clothing. He had blood on him because he had shot 2 people at close range. The young people at the house also saw Mark Brown counting money. He had taken money from the store during the robbery. At around 9:55 that evening, the police received a phone call. Someone reported that a robbery was happening at the Midway Market. Officers from the Youngstown Police Department were sent to the store. When the officers arrived at the scene, they went inside. They found the bodies of Isam Salman and Haider Alturk behind the counter. Both men were dead. The police also found a blunt, cigar, and a packet of marijuana on the floor near the bodies. These items had been left behind during the events. The police examined the scene. They found shell casings on the floor. These were the empty bullet cases that came from the gun that was fired. The shell casings were later examined and matched to the 9mm handgun that Mark Brown had used. The police also recovered bullets from the bodies of the two victims during the autopsies. Dr. Anil Nalyuri was the chief deputy coroner. He performed the autopsies on both victims. He determined that the cause of death for both men was hemorrhage and shock. This was caused by the gunshot wounds to their heads. Both victims died quickly from their injuries. The police took note of all the physical evidence at the crime scene. They also started talking to witnesses who had been in the area. Some of the young people who had been at the Dotson house told the police what they had seen. They described Mark Brown going into the store with a mask and a gun. They described hearing the shots. They described seeing him wipe his gun and count money afterward. The police also found a blunt and marijuana at the scene, which confirmed that Mark Brown and his friends had been smoking drugs that night. All of the evidence started to point toward Mark Brown as the person who had committed these murders. The store owner's family was devastated. Isam Salman left behind a wife and 7 children. He was a father who supported his family by working in the store. Haider Al-Turk was a young man who had worked at the store for about a year. Both men were killed while they were simply doing their jobs. They were not expecting to be attacked. They had no way to defend themselves against a man with a gun who came into the store with the intent to rob and kill. Mark Brown had carried out the violent act that he had talked about earlier that night. He had taken drugs and alcohol that reduced his ability to control himself. He had a gun that he was willing to use. He had a plan to copy a scene from a movie. He entered the store with a mask on his face. He shot 2 innocent men multiple times. He then tried to lie about what had happened. He said the shots were firecrackers. He wiped his gun to remove evidence. He counted the money he had stolen. The crime was brutal, and it happened quickly. The victims had no chance to escape or fight back. After the police found the bodies and began their initial work at the scene, they knew they had a double murder case on their hands. They had witnesses who could describe the suspect. They had shell casings. They had the marijuana and other items left behind. The investigation was just beginning, but the immediate aftermath of the crime was clear. 2 men were dead, and the person who killed them had fled the scene. After the police found the bodies of Isam Salman and Haider Al-Turk at the Midway Market, they began a full investigation. Lieutenant David McKnight and other detectives interviewed many witnesses. They spoke with the young people who had been at the Dotson house on the night of the murders. Those witnesses gave clear descriptions of what they had seen. They told the police about Mark Brown, his mask, his gun, and the shots they heard. They also described how Brown had wiped his gun and counted money afterward. Based on the information from witnesses, the police identified Mark Brown as the main suspect. On January 31st, 1994, Lieutenant McKnight secured a warrant for Brown's arrest. This meant the police had legal permission to take him into custody. They then began searching for him. On February 3rd, 1994, the police found Mark Brown. He was in an apartment in Warren, Ohio. Warren is a city not far from Youngstown. The officers entered the apartment and arrested him. During the arrest, they searched the area where he was staying. Underneath some cushions on a couch, they found a 9mm handgun. This was the same type of gun that had been used in the murders. The police seized the weapon as evidence. The police took Mark Brown to the Youngstown Police Department for questioning. 2 detectives, Detective Mayetta and Detective McKnight, were the ones who interviewed him. Before they asked any questions, they read Brown his Miranda rights. This is the warning that tells a suspect they have the right to remain silent and the right to have a lawyer present. Brown signed a written form that said he understood these rights, and he agreed to talk to the police without a lawyer present. During the questioning, Brown admitted that he had been at the Midway Market, but at first he tried to blame his friend Alan Thomas. He said that Alan Thomas was the shooter. The detectives then asked Brown if he knew that there were video cameras in the store. In reality, the cameras were not working that night. But the detectives did not tell Brown this. Brown said he had not noticed any cameras. The detectives told him that there were 2 cameras. Brown then said, "Well, I guess you know what happened there then." When the detectives said yes, Brown replied, "Well, you've got me." He also said, "Then you know I did it." After this, Brown confessed to shooting one of the victims. He said he shot Haider al-Turk, but he denied shooting Isam Salman. He said he did not remember shooting Salman. He also said that he just flipped out while he was in the store. He blamed his actions on the Valium that he had taken. He said, "It's the Valiums. They make you go off." He told the police that he got the gun from a friend named Stephen Dotson. He expressed regret for what happened. The police sent the handgun they had recovered from the apartment to a crime lab for testing. A forensic scientist named Michael Roberts examined the gun. He also examined the 9 shell casings that had been found at the Midway Market. He compared them. He concluded that all 9 cartridge casings had been fired from the same 9mm Glock handgun that was found under the couch cushions. He also examined the 4 bullets that had been removed from the bodies of the 2 victims. He determined that those bullets were fired from a Glock weapon, but he could not say with absolute certainty that they came from the specific gun found in the apartment. However, the shell casings were a very strong piece of evidence linking Brown to both murders. The police also learned more about where the gun had come from. A man named Steve Jones came forward. He said that on December 15, 1993, Mark Brown had robbed him at gunpoint. During that robbery, Brown took Jones's car. Inside the trunk of that car was Jones's Glock 9mm handgun. This is how Brown obtained the weapon that he later used in the murders. On March 4, 1994, the Mahoning County Grand Jury indicted Mark Brown. This means they formally charged him with crimes. He was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts related to Isam Salman, and 2 counts related to Haider al-Turk. The charges included death penalty specifications. These specifications said that the murders were committed as part of a course of conduct that involved killing 2 or more people. There were also firearm specifications. Brown was also charged with aggravated robbery and having a weapon under disability. The trial began in early 1996. The prosecution presented all of its evidence. They called witnesses who had seen Brown at the scene. They presented the shell casings and the gun. They presented Brown's confession. The defense argued that Brown had only shot 1 victim and that Alan Thomas was responsible for the other. Brown himself took the stand and testified. He told the jury that he had shot al-Turk but not Salman. He also said that he had asked for a lawyer during the interrogation but was denied. The prosecution argued that Brown was guilty of both murders. The jury listened to all the evidence. They reached their verdicts. They found Brown guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder committed with prior calculation and design. They found him guilty of the firearm specifications. They also found him guilty of the death penalty specification that the murders were committed as a course of conduct. However, the jury acquitted Brown of the specifications that said the murders were committed during an aggravated robbery. They also found him not guilty of the aggravated robbery charge itself. The trial then moved to the penalty phase. This is the part where the jury decides whether the defendant should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The jury deliberated for a long time. They were deadlocked at one point. The judge gave them an instruction to encourage them to continue deliberating. Eventually, the jury reached a decision. They recommended that Brown receive the death penalty for the murder of Isam Salman. For the murder of Haider al-Turk, they recommended life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The judge followed the jury's recommendation. On February 28, 1996, the judge sentenced Mark Brown. He received the death penalty for the murder of Isam Salman. He received a life sentence for the murder of Haider al-Turk, with parole eligibility after 30 years. He also received 3 additional years for the firearm specification on each count. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively, meaning one after the other. After the trial, Brown's lawyers filed appeals. They argued that his confession was not voluntary, that the jury instructions were coercive, and that other legal errors occurred. The case went to the Ohio Supreme Court. In 2003, the Ohio Supreme Court affirmed the convictions and the death sentence. The court found that Brown's confession was voluntary and that the trial was fair. Brown then filed for post-conviction relief, but that was also denied. He then filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. The case went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2008, the Sixth Circuit denied his petition. All of his appeals were exhausted. He had no more legal options to stop the execution. The state of Ohio scheduled Brown's execution for February 4, 2010. On the day before the execution, he was transported from the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown to the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. That evening, he made many phone calls. He spoke with friends, his sister, his attorney, and 2 of the mothers of his children. He also had visits with his brother, his spiritual advisor, and his attorney. He learned at about 7 p.m. that Governor Ted Strickland had denied his request for clemency. He became emotional after hearing this news. He ate a special meal that included a bacon double cheeseburger, onion rings, orange soda, and ice cream. He slept for a short time during the early morning hours. On the morning of February 4, 2010, Brown woke up at 6:20 a.m. He showered. He had visits with his spiritual advisor and his attorneys. He laughed and joked with them. He prayed with the prison chaplains. He drank a cup of ice water. The U.S. Supreme Court turned down his final appeals just after 9 a.m. This caused a short delay in the execution process. The prison staff prepared Brown for the execution. They inserted shunts into veins in both of his arms. He then walked from his holding cell to the death chamber. He took 17 steps to reach the chamber. He was strapped to a table. He stared at the ceiling. A prison official asked if he had any last words. He offered only a quiet no. He did not make eye contact with anyone. The execution began at about 10:40 a.m. Ohio was using a new single-drug protocol at this time. This meant that only one drug, thiopental sodium, was used. It is a powerful anesthetic. A large, lethal dose was injected into his veins. Within about 1 minute, Brown closed his eyes and yawned. His chest heaved briefly. After that, all movement stopped. At 10:49 a.m., officials pronounced him dead. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Witnesses watched the execution. On behalf of Brown, his spiritual advisor and his attorney were present. 7 members of Isam Salman's family were at the prison. 3 of them witnessed the execution: Salman's sister Terry Rasool, his brother Walid Salman, and his son Majdi Salman. The sister held a photograph of the murder victims. They watched silently as Brown's body was removed from the death chamber and placed into a hearse. Afterward, Terry Rasool spoke to reporters. She said, "As sad as this may be, justice has been served." She expressed hope that young people would learn a lesson from what happened. Brown had requested that his body be cremated. His ashes were to be given to his sister. The victims' families continued to grieve for their loved ones. Isam Salman's wife and 7 children had to go on without him. Haider al-Turk's family also had to live with their loss. The execution brought the legal process to its conclusion, but it could not bring back the 2 men who were killed on that night in January 1994. Mark Aaron Brown was the 35th person executed in Ohio since the state resumed executions in 1999. He was the 2nd person executed in Ohio in 2010. He was the third person executed under the state's new single-drug protocol. The case was closed. The criminal had been caught, tried, convicted, and punished according to the law. The justice system had run its full course from the initial investigation to the final moment of execution. The story of Mark Aaron Brown ended on February 4th, 2010, when he was pronounced dead at 10:49 a.m., leaving behind 2 dead victims and 2 families forever changed by his actions. Story 4. Martin Edward Grossman was born on January 19, 1965. He was born in the United States and grew up in Florida. His family was not wealthy. They lived a simple life. Martin was a white male. He had family members who cared about him, including his mother, Myra Grossman, and his grandmother. When Martin was a young boy, he seemed like a normal child. He went to school like other children. He had friends and played with them. But as he got older, things started to change. He did not do well in his classes. He found school difficult and did not enjoy it. Eventually, he stopped going to school and did not finish junior high. This meant he did not have a high school diploma or any advanced education. Martin's father passed away when Martin was 15 years old. This was a very hard time for the family. Martin was still a teenager when he lost his father. After his father died, Martin's mother, Myra, had to raise him and his siblings on her own. The family went through emotional and financial struggles. Martin was affected by his father's death, and his behavior started to change around this time. Martin had a close friend named Brian Hancock. Brian lived with the Grossman family at one point. Martin also had another friend named Stephen Martakas, who considered Martin like a brother. Martin also had friends named Thane Taylor and Brian Allen, who he spent time with. Martin was social and had a group of friends he trusted and spent time with regularly. In his teenage years, Martin started getting into trouble. He committed crimes. He was arrested and sent to prison for a burglary. On January 2nd, 1983, Martin committed a burglary. He broke into a dwelling or occupied conveyance. He also committed grand theft. The theft involved property worth more than $300, but less than $20,000. He was arrested for these crimes on May 18, 1983, in Pasco County, Florida. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for these offenses. Martin spent time in prison for these crimes. He did not enjoy being locked up. He did not like the rules and the loss of freedom. He found prison to be a very unpleasant experience. He told his friends many times that he never wanted to go back to prison. This fear of returning to prison was something he talked about often. He did not want to experience that again. After serving his time, Martin was released from prison. He was put on probation. Probation meant he had to follow strict rules. He had to stay out of trouble. He had to report to a probation officer. He could not possess weapons. He had to stay within certain areas. He was not allowed to leave Pasco County without permission. These rules were part of his release from prison. Martin lived with his mother, Myra, in Pasco County, Florida. He was trying to stay out of trouble. He did not have a steady job. He spent time with his friends. He would hang out with them and drive around. He did not have a clear direction in life. He was a young man who had already been to prison and was trying to avoid going back. Martin had a habit of not following rules. He would still do things that were against the law. He did not seem to learn from his past mistakes. He continued to associate with friends who were also involved in criminal activities. He did not make an effort to change his lifestyle. He was a large man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing about 220 pounds. He was much bigger and stronger than many people. Martin told his friends that he would never go back to jail. He repeated this many times. He was very clear about his feelings on this matter. He said he would do anything to avoid returning to prison. His friends heard him say this on multiple occasions. They knew he was serious about not wanting to be locked up again. Martin did not show any signs of being a violent person before the events that later happened. His friends and family said he was non-violent. His mother described him as a normal person. His friend Stephen said he was respectful to his mother and encouraged others to avoid drugs. However, Martin had a criminal record. He had committed burglary and theft. He had been in prison. He was on probation. He had a pattern of breaking the law and not following the rules set by the courts. Martin's life up to this point was marked by instability. He lost his father at a young age. He did not finish school. He committed crimes and went to prison. He was released but still did not make good choices. He continued to spend time with friends who were also engaged in illegal activities. He was a young man who was afraid of going back to prison, but did not take the steps needed to stay out of trouble. He did not have a steady job. He did not have a stable future. He was living day by day, hanging out with his friends, and not thinking about the consequences of his actions. Martin was 19 years old at the time of the events that would change his life forever. He had already been through prison. He had been released. He was on probation. He had a fear of returning to jail that was very strong. He had friends who he spent time with regularly. He had a family that cared about him. He had a past filled with bad decisions and criminal behavior. His life was not heading in a positive direction. He was still making poor choices and spending time with people who were also making poor choices. On the night of December 13th, 1984, Martin Grossman was still living with his mother in Pasco County, Florida. He was still on probation from his previous prison sentence. The rules of his probation were strict. He was not allowed to possess any weapons. He was also not allowed to leave Pasco County without permission. But Grossman did not follow these rules. Earlier that day, Grossman had obtained a handgun. He got this gun by burglarizing a home. The gun was stolen property. Grossman wanted to shoot the gun for fun. He asked his 17-year-old friend, Thane Taylor, to go with him. Taylor agreed. They got into Grossman's van and drove to a wooded area in Pinellas County. This was outside Pasco County. By driving there, Grossman was already breaking the rules of his probation. They arrived at the wooded area. The place was quiet and dark. It was a nature preserve known as the Brooker Creek Preserve. Grossman and Taylor started shooting the stolen handgun. They fired several rounds into the trees or the ground. They were just having fun with the weapon. They did not know that someone was watching them. A woman named Margaret Park was patrolling the area that night. She was 26 years old. Everyone called her Peggy. She was a wildlife officer for the Florida Game and Fish Commission. Her job was to protect wildlife and enforce laws in the woods and preserve areas. She had graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in natural resources and wildlife management. She had been working as a wildlife officer since 1982. She was dedicated to her job and loved animals and nature. She was patrolling alone in her official vehicle. The vehicle had its motor running, its lights on, and its flashers activated. Officer Park noticed Grossman's van. She became suspicious. She drove closer to the van and stopped. She got out of her vehicle and approached the two young men. She asked them questions. She wanted to know what they were doing. She asked if they had any guns. Grossman and Taylor lied and said they did not have any weapons. But Officer Park did not believe them. She searched their van. Under the driver's seat, she found the stolen handgun. She also took Grossman's driver's license. Officer Park told Grossman that he was under arrest. She confiscated the gun and his license. She had the legal authority to do this because she was a law enforcement officer. Grossman became very scared. He knew that possessing a weapon was a violation of his probation. He also knew that being outside of Pasco County was another violation. He knew that if Officer Park reported him, he would be sent back to prison. He did not want to go back to prison. He had told his friends many times that he would never go back to jail. Grossman started pleading with Officer Park. He begged her to let him go. He asked her not to report him. He told her that he would be sent back to prison if she turned him in. He was desperate. He was afraid of going back to the place he hated so much. Officer Park listened to his pleas, but she did not agree. She refused to let him go. Her job was to enforce the law, and she was going to do her job. Officer Park walked back to her vehicle. She opened the driver's door. She reached inside and picked up her radio microphone. She was going to call the sheriff's office to report the violation. She wanted to tell them about Grossman's probation violation and the stolen gun. She pressed the button on the radio to speak. At that moment, Grossman made a decision. He did not want to be arrested. He did not want to go back to prison. So he decided to stop her from making the call. He grabbed the officer's large metal flashlight. This flashlight was heavy and made of metal. It was a tool that Officer Park carried for her job. Grossman raised the flashlight and struck Officer Park on the head with it. He hit her with a lot of force. He hit her on the head and on the shoulders. He hit her again and again. The blows forced her upper body into the vehicle. Officer Park was in pain, but she managed to speak into the radio. She said the words, "I'm hit." She also screamed. The radio transmission went through. Deputies from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office heard her call. They started responding to her location right away. They knew something was wrong, but they were far away and could not get there quickly. Grossman kept hitting her with the flashlight. He hit her many times. His statements later showed that he hit her 20 to 30 times. The blows caused deep cuts and injuries to her head. The metal flashlight broke her skin and caused a lot of bleeding. But Officer Park was still fighting. She was not unconscious. She was a strong and determined woman. Grossman needed help. He called out to Taylor. He yelled for Taylor to come and assist him. Taylor heard the call and came over. Taylor joined the assault on Officer Park. He grabbed her legs or helped hold her down. The two young men were working together to overpower the officer. Officer Park did not give up. She was still fighting for her life. She managed to reach for her own weapon. She was carrying a .357 Magnum handgun. She pulled it out of its holster. She fired one shot from inside the vehicle. The bullet was wild. It did not hit anyone. It struck the inside of the vehicle. At the same time, she kicked Taylor. She kicked him hard in the groin. Taylor was temporarily disabled. He fell to the ground in pain. Officer Park was still trying to survive. But Grossman was much bigger than Officer Park. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed about 220 pounds. Officer Park was much smaller. She was about a foot shorter and 100 pounds lighter. Grossman used his size and strength to overpower her. He wrestled the .357 Magnum out of her hands. In the struggle, he broke her fingers. He took the gun away from her. Officer Park was now in a helpless position. Her upper body was inside the vehicle. Her head was bent over or turned downward. She was still in the driver's seat area. She had been beaten badly. She had lost her weapon. Grossman held her own gun in his hands. He pointed it at the back of her head. He pulled the trigger. He fired one shot. The bullet entered the back of her head on the left side. It passed through her brain and exited on the right side. The bullet then fell into a drinking cup inside the vehicle. Officer Park died instantly. The beating and the shooting had happened very quickly. Officer Park had fought hard, but she was outmatched. Grossman had killed her to prevent her from reporting him. He did not want to go back to prison. That was the reason he shot her. After the shooting, Grossman and Taylor did not stay at the scene. They took back the stolen handgun that Officer Park had confiscated. They took back Grossman's driver's license. They also took Officer Park's .357 Magnum handgun. They took all the weapons and the license. Then they fled the scene. They got into Grossman's van and drove away as fast as they could. They drove back to the Grossman home in Pasco County. They arrived at the house. They were both covered in blood. Grossman had blood all over his clothes and shoes. They ran inside the house. They were very excited and scared. Brian Hancock was at the house. He lived with the Grossman family at that time. Grossman and Taylor told Hancock what had happened. Grossman said that he shot a police officer. Taylor confirmed the same story. Hancock was scared. He did not know what to do. Grossman told Hancock to help them hide the evidence. Hancock and Taylor took the two handguns and buried them near the crime scene. They buried them in a wooded area of Pasco County. This was their attempt to get rid of the weapons. Grossman tried to get rid of his bloody clothes. He took off the clothing and shoes he had been wearing during the attack. He tried to burn them. He set them on fire in the backyard. But the clothes and shoes did not burn completely. They were charred but not destroyed. So Grossman and Taylor took the partially burned items and threw them into a nearby lake. They hoped the water would hide the evidence. The next day, December 14th, 1984, Grossman and Taylor cleaned the van. They washed it thoroughly. They wanted to remove any blood or evidence from inside the vehicle. They also changed the tires on the van. They were trying to make it look like nothing had happened. They did not want the police to connect their van to the crime scene. About a week later, on December 20th, 1984, Grossman and Taylor met up with another friend, Brian Allen. Allen had just returned to Pasco County. Grossman showed Allen a newspaper article about Officer Park's murder. Grossman told Allen, "I did it, man, I killed her." He then told Allen the same story. He explained how Officer Park found the gun, how she refused to let him go, how he beat her with the flashlight, how she fired a shot, and how he took her gun and shot her in the head. Allen listened to everything. During this time, the police were already investigating Officer Park's murder. They had heard her radio call. They had found her body in the vehicle. They had collected evidence at the crime scene. They had found blood spatter, the bullet in the cup, and other physical clues. But they did not yet know who had killed her. They had no suspects at that time. They were looking for leads. On December 25th, 1984, Brian Hancock made a decision. He was scared of Grossman. Grossman had threatened Hancock's life. But Hancock decided to go to the police anyway. He went to the authorities and told them everything he knew. He told them about the murder. He told them about the buried guns. He told them about the burning of the clothes. He gave the police the information they needed to find Grossman and Taylor. The police now had a clear lead. They knew who to look for. They knew about Grossman and Taylor. They had Hancock's statement. They also had physical evidence from the crime scene. They began to put the pieces together. They realized that Grossman had killed the wildlife officer to avoid going back to prison. They had a suspect, and they knew what had happened, but they had not yet arrested anyone. The investigation was moving forward. On December 25th, 1984, Brian Hancock made the decision to go to the police. He was scared of Grossman, but he told the authorities everything he knew. He told them about the murder of Officer Park. He told them about the two guns that were buried near the crime scene. He told them about the attempted burning of the clothes and shoes. He gave the police all the details he had heard from Grossman and Taylor. This was the break that the police needed. They now had clear information about who had committed the crime. The police acted quickly on Hancock's information. They located the buried weapons. One was the stolen handgun that Grossman had originally used. The other was Officer Park's .357 Magnum service weapon. The serial number on the .357 matched Officer Park's gun. This was strong physical evidence linking Grossman and Taylor to the murder. The police also found the partially burned shoes and clothing in the lake. They recovered these items as evidence. Soon after Hancock's statement, the police arrested Martin Grossman and Thane Taylor. They were taken into custody. When Taylor was arrested, he confessed to the police. He gave a detailed account of what happened on the night of December 13th, 1984. He told the police about driving to the woods with Grossman, shooting the stolen gun, being confronted by Officer Park, and the attack that followed. He described how Grossman beat Officer Park and then shot her. Taylor's confession matched the physical evidence at the scene. After Grossman was arrested, he was placed in the Pinellas County Jail while awaiting trial. He was in a cell with another inmate named Charles Brewer. Grossman talked to Brewer about the murder. He told Brewer the same story he had told Hancock and Allen. He said he did not want to be arrested by a female officer. He said he did not want to go back to jail. He told Brewer about beating Officer Park with her flashlight and then shooting her with her own gun. He even corrected details that were in the newspaper, showing that he had personal knowledge of the crime. Brewer later testified about these conversations during the trial. Grossman and Taylor were tried together. Grossman's lawyers asked for the trials to be separated. They did not want Taylor's confession to be used against Grossman, but the judge denied this request. The joint trial proceeded. The prosecution presented a strong case. They called Hancock, Allen, and Brewer as witnesses. Each of them testified about what Grossman had told them. The prosecution also presented physical evidence. This included the buried guns, the charred shoes, the blood spatter analysis, and Grossman's fingerprints found on Officer Park's vehicle and flashlight. The evidence against Grossman was overwhelming. During the trial, the jury heard all of this evidence. Taylor's confession to the police was also introduced. The judge told the jury that they could only use Taylor's confession against Taylor, not against Grossman. But the jury still heard the details. Grossman did not testify in his own defense. He did not present any witnesses during the guilt phase. On October 29, 1985, the jury reached a verdict. They found Grossman guilty of first-degree murder. They found Taylor guilty of third-degree murder. The difference in verdicts showed that the jury believed Grossman was the primary actor and the one who fired the fatal shot. The trial then moved to the penalty phase. The jury had to decide whether Grossman should receive the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution presented no additional evidence during this phase. The defense called several witnesses. Grossman's mother, Myra, testified that her son was nonviolent and that his father had died when Martin was young. 2 jail employees testified that Grossman was well behaved in custody. His best friend, Stephen Martakis, testified that Grossman was like a brother to him and had encouraged him to avoid drugs. After hearing this testimony, the jury deliberated for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. On October 31, 1985, they returned their recommendation. The vote was unanimous. All 12 jurors recommended that Grossman be sentenced to death. The judge then made the final decision. He considered the aggravating factors. He found that the murder was committed during a robbery or burglary. He found that it was committed to avoid arrest. He also found that the murder was especially wicked, atrocious, and cruel because of the brutal beating that preceded the shooting. He found no mitigating circumstances that outweighed these factors. On December 13, 1985, exactly 1 year after the murder, the judge formally sentenced Martin Grossman to death. Taylor received a different sentence. Because he was only 17 and played a lesser role, he was convicted of third-degree murder. He served about 3 years in prison and was eventually released. Grossman began the appeals process immediately. He had the right to challenge his conviction and sentence. His lawyers filed a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. On February 18, 1988, the Florida Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and death sentence. They found that the evidence was sufficient and that the trial had been fair. Grossman then asked the United States Supreme Court to review his case. On March 6, 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. This meant his conviction was final. Over the next 2 decades, Grossman filed many more appeals. He filed petitions for post-conviction relief in state court. He filed petitions for habeas corpus in federal court. He argued that his lawyers had been ineffective. He argued that the state had withheld evidence. He argued that his mental capacity was impaired. The Florida Supreme Court denied these petitions on December 18, 1997. The federal courts also denied his claims. On October 16, 2006, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit affirmed the denial of his habeas petition. On May 21, 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court again declined to hear his case. All of his legal options had been exhausted. On January 12, 2010, Florida Governor Charlie Crist signed a death warrant for Grossman. This set the date of execution. Many people and groups tried to stop the execution. More than 33,000 people signed an online petition to spare his life. Over 110 rabbis wrote letters asking for a stay of execution. They argued that Grossman had become a religious man and had shown remorse. The Vatican sent a letter to the governor on behalf of Pope Benedict XVI, asking for Grossman's life to be spared. They said he had repented and changed his ways. Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz also supported Grossman. He argued that the crime was not planned and that Grossman had mental issues. All of these efforts failed. The courts refused to stop the execution. On February 16, 2010, Grossman was taken to the Florida State Prison near Stark, Florida. He was 45 years old. He had spent 25 years on death row. He did not request a special last meal. Instead, he bought a chicken sandwich, a can of fruit punch, and banana cream and peanut butter cookies from the prison canteen. He ate this simple meal before the execution. At 6 p.m., the execution team led Grossman into the death chamber. He was placed on a gurney. His hands were strapped to arm boards. Needles were inserted into both arms. The curtain was raised, and witnesses could see him through a window. Among the witnesses were Officer Park's mother, sister, and brother. They had traveled from Ohio to see the execution. They sat in the front row, directly in front of Grossman. The warden asked Grossman if he had any last words. Grossman spoke clearly. He said, "I would like to extend my heartfelt remorse to the victim's family. I fully regret everything that occurred that night, for everything that was done, whether I remember it or not. I accept responsibility." Then he recited a Jewish prayer called the Shema. This is a central prayer in Judaism. It is traditional for Jews to say this prayer as their final words. After he finished the prayer, the execution began. The lethal injection process started at 6:02 p.m. The chemicals flowed into Grossman's body. He closed his eyes and appeared to go to sleep. The warden called out his name, shook his body, and brushed against his eyelashes to make sure he was unconscious. Then the final chemical was administered to stop his heart. At 6:17 p.m., the doctor used a stethoscope and pronounced Martin Edward Grossman dead. After the execution, Officer Park's mother, Margaret, spoke to the press. She said she was thinking about the children in Haiti who had died in a recent earthquake. She said they had hard deaths. She said Grossman had an easy death in comparison. Officer Park's sister, Betsy, said the execution was long overdue. She said Grossman's apology was sincere, but came 25 years too late. She expressed sadness that her father had passed away in 2000 and did not live to see the execution. She said the family had endured years of reminders of how Peggy died, overshadowing the memories of how she lived. She was glad that the process had finally ended. The body of Officer Margaret Park had been cremated long before. Her ashes were scattered near the eagle nests she had worked to protect. A nature trail in Pinellas County was named in her honor. A memorial plaque was placed near the spot where she was murdered. Her family continued to remember her as the dedicated wildlife officer and loving daughter she had been. Martin Grossman was the 69th person executed in Florida since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. He was the 7th person executed in the United States in 2010. His death marked the end of a long legal process that had lasted more than 25 years. The family of Margaret Park finally had closure. The case was officially closed. Story 5. Michael Adam Segala was born on December 11, 1977, in Texas. He grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, specifically in Tarrant County. His family life was not stable or easy. According to later statements from his defense lawyers, he had a poor family background. His mother was a presence in his life and tried to care for him, but there is little information about his father. Michael did not have a normal, peaceful childhood. As a young boy, Michael started to show signs of trouble. He did not follow rules well. When he was 13 years old, he was arrested for burglary. This was his first serious contact with the police. Burglary means he entered a building illegally to steal things. This arrest was a clear warning sign that he was moving toward a life of crime. But the warning did not stop him. The next year, when Michael was 14, his behavior got worse. He was banned from the grounds of the Plano public schools. The reason was serious. He was caught carrying a gun on school property. This was not a small mistake. Carrying a gun at school was dangerous and illegal. This ban meant he could not go to regular school in that district. His education suffered from this point onward. He never completed high school. He dropped out after the 11th grade, which meant he had only about 10 years of formal education. Without a high school diploma, Michael had trouble finding good jobs. He worked as a laborer for some time. He also found work as a security guard at a place called Lone Star Park, which is a horse racing track in the Dallas area. But these jobs did not last long. His real problem was drugs. He started using illegal drugs at a young age. His drug use became a habit that he could not control. To pay for his drugs, he began stealing things. He would steal videos from retail stores and sell them. He used the money to buy drugs and also to visit topless bars. This pattern of stealing to support his drug habit continued for several years. Over time, Michael was caught for his crimes many times. He had 3 convictions for theft. He was also convicted for possession of marijuana, which is a misdemeanor. These arrests and convictions showed that he was not learning from his mistakes. He kept breaking the law. In 1999, his criminal behavior reached a new level. He committed a robbery. Robbery means taking something from a person by using force or threats. For this crime, he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years of probation. Probation meant he did not have to go to prison, but he had to follow strict rules set by the court. He had to report to a probation officer. He also had to stay out of trouble. As part of his probation, Michael was ordered to go to a drug treatment center. This center was in Wilmer, a town south of Dallas. The treatment center was supposed to help him stop using drugs. But Michael did not take it seriously. He had already attended drug rehabilitation programs before, but they had not worked. He kept using drugs. At the treatment center, he was not locked up permanently. He was allowed to leave for certain reasons, as long as he followed the rules. One of the main rules was that he had to look for a job. Getting a job was a requirement for his final release from the program. If he could not find a job, he would not be allowed to leave the center permanently. During this time, Michael also had personal thoughts that were disturbing. He told his mother that he believed he was a sociopath. A sociopath is a person who does not care about other people's feelings or rights. He also told her that he found it funny when other people were in pain. These statements were very worrying. They showed that his mind was not working in a normal way. He did not feel empathy, which is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. Despite these clear red flags, no one stopped him from being allowed to leave the treatment center for short periods. On the morning of August 22, 2000, Michael was given a one-day pass from the treatment center. He was allowed to leave for the day so that he could look for a job. This was a standard part of his probation. He was supposed to go out, find work, and return to the center by the end of the day. He had been given this freedom because the authorities believed he was trying to get his life back on track. But Michael had no real plan to find a job. His drug addiction, and his criminal instincts were still strong. He left the treatment center that morning, and he did not go looking for honest work. Instead, he went into the city of Plano. He was carrying a handgun. He did not know what he was going to do, but he was ready to commit a crime. He was looking for an opportunity. That day, he found an apartment complex. He entered the apartment of a couple he did not know. This action would change everything, but that part of the story comes later. Now Michael Adam Segala was out on the streets, free for the day, with a gun and a history of violence and theft. He had no job, no money, and no intention of following the rules. He had already made the decision to break the law again. But what happened next was far worse than anyone could have predicted. Michael left the drug treatment center on the morning of August 22nd, 2000. He had a one-day pass to look for a job, but he did not look for work. Instead, he went to Plano, a city near Dallas. He carried a handgun with him. He had no specific target in mind. He was simply looking for a place to rob. He came to an apartment complex. He did not know the people who lived there. He picked an apartment at random. This apartment belonged to a young married couple. The husband was Kleber dos Santos. He was 28 years old. He was from Brazil and worked as a software developer for a cell phone company in Richardson, Texas. He had come to Texas in January 2000, just 1 month after getting married. The wife was Lilian dos Santos. She was 25 years old. She was also from Brazil and was studying to be a veterinarian at the University of Sao Paulo. She was visiting her husband during a school break. They were a happy, hard-working couple with no connection to drugs or crime. Michael entered their apartment unlawfully. This means he went inside without permission. Once inside, he took out his gun and shot Kleber 1 time in the head. The bullet killed Kleber instantly. Kleber did not have time to defend himself. He fell to the floor and died right there. Now Michael was alone in the apartment with Lillian. She had just watched her husband get shot. She was terrified. Michael forced Lillian to remove all of her clothes. He then made her wash herself. After that, he took telephone cords and used them to tie her hands together. He also wrapped a telephone cord around her neck. He made her lie down on the bed. What happened next was a long and cruel attack. Michael did not kill Lillian right away. Instead, he tortured her. He took a belt or a rod-like object and whipped her buttocks. He used a knife or sharp object to cut the inside of her thigh. He took a candle that was in the apartment and lit it. He dripped hot candle wax onto her private parts. All of this caused Lillian severe pain and fear. While he was torturing Lillian, Michael sexually gratified himself. He masturbated and ejaculated onto the floor next to the bed. He did all of this while Lillian was still alive and lying on the bed, tied up and helpless. Then, after he finished his acts of torture and sexual assault, he shot Lillian. He shot her once in the face, and then a second time in the side of her head. These gunshots killed her. She died on the bed, still tied up and naked. Michael did not leave the apartment right away. He stayed there for a long time. He was not in a hurry. He went to the kitchen and helped himself to a drink. He sat down and watched television for a while. He acted as if he was comfortable in the apartment. Then he started to clean up. He tried to remove all evidence of his presence. He wiped his fingerprints off of everything he had touched. He cleaned the carpet where he had ejaculated. He wanted to make sure the police could not find him. After cleaning, Michael began to go through the apartment. He looked for things he could steal. He took the couple's wedding rings. He also took several other items, including a camera and some jewelry. He gathered these things and put them in his pockets. Then he finally left the apartment. He did not close the door properly. He just walked away and went back to his normal life. The bodies were not found right away. The next day, on August 23rd, 2000, Kleber did not show up for work. His co-workers were surprised because he was a reliable employee. They became worried. A neighbor went to check on the couple. The neighbor found the apartment door open or unlocked. When the neighbor looked inside, they saw the bodies. They immediately called the police. The police arrived at the apartment. They saw a terrible scene. Kleber's body was on the floor with a gunshot wound to his head. Lillian's body was on the bed, naked, with her hands and neck tied with telephone cords. She had been shot twice in the head. The police also noticed that the apartment had been ransacked. Items were missing. The wedding rings were gone. The police found the telephone cords used to tie Lillian. They found the candle wax on her body. They noticed the cleaned area on the carpet. They collected samples from that area. They also found bullet casings. They took photographs of everything. The police began their work. They interviewed the neighbors. They asked questions. They tried to find out who had entered the apartment. They collected all the physical evidence from the scene. But at that time, they did not yet know who the killer was. They had no suspect. They had a gun, but no registration. They had semen, but no name to match it to. They knew that the killer had taken items, but they did not know where those items had gone. The police started investigating, but they did not make an arrest immediately. The case was still a mystery. They had many clues, but no one to connect them to. The investigation was just beginning. The police knew that someone had entered the apartment, killed the couple, stolen their belongings, and then left. They had evidence from the scene, including the semen and the bullet casings. But they still needed to find the person who did this. That person was Michael Adam Segala, and he was still walking free. The police had collected evidence from the Dos Santos apartment, but they did not have a suspect. They knew the killer had stolen items, including a camera and wedding rings. They knew the killer had left semen on the floor. They knew the bullets came from a handgun, but none of this gave them a name. For 2 months, the case remained unsolved. Then, in October 2000, the first break came. A camera that had been taken from the Dos Santos apartment was found at a pawn shop in Arlington, Texas. Arlington is about 30 miles southwest of Plano. The pawn shop owner had records of who sold the camera. The police followed this lead. They traced the camera back to the person who had pawned it. That person was not Michael Segala directly, but the trail led to him. The police then found more stolen items from the apartment at other pawn shops in Dallas. These items included the couple's wedding rings. The police traced these items as well. All of them led back to Michael Adam Segala. On October 19, 2000, the police arrested Michael. He was taken into custody in Dallas. He was first arrested on a warrant related to his probation violation. But once the police had him, they began to question him about the murders. They brought him to the Plano Police Department. They placed him in an interview room. The detectives who questioned him were Scott Epperson and Keith Grisham. The interview started around midnight and went on for several hours. Michael was given a blanket because he was cold. He was also read his legal rights, which told him he did not have to speak and could have a lawyer. Michael said he understood his rights and agreed to talk. At first, Michael denied everything. He said he had nothing to do with the murders. But the police kept asking questions. They had evidence that connected him to the stolen items. They also had physical evidence from the apartment. After some time, Michael began to confess. He admitted that he had killed Kleber Dos Santos. He admitted that he had ejaculated while Lillian was lying on the bed. He admitted that he had stolen the couple's rings. But he did not take full responsibility for everything. He tried to blame the torture and killing of Lillian on another person. He said that he had an accomplice named Billy. He claimed that he and Billy went to the apartment to sell heroin to Kleber. He said that Kleber attacked Billy with a baseball bat and that he shot Kleber in self-defense. He also said that Billy was the one who tortured and killed Lillian. The police investigated this story. They found no evidence of a second attacker. No one named Billy was ever found. There was no evidence that Kleber or Lillian used drugs. Toxicology reports showed no drugs in their bodies. The police found only Michael's DNA and his fingerprints at the scene. They concluded that Michael was lying to try to reduce his guilt. The police also tested the semen that was found on the floor next to the bed. They compared it to Michael's DNA. The test came back as an exact match. This meant that the semen definitely came from Michael. The police also had a firearms expert examine the bullets. The expert confirmed that all the bullets recovered from the scene were fired from the same gun. That gun was linked to Michael. The evidence was strong and clear. Michael was charged with capital murder for the death of Kleber dos Santos. The law allows a capital murder charge when a person kills someone during the commission of another serious crime, such as robbery or sexual assault. In this case, Michael had killed Kleber while committing aggravated sexual assault on Lillian. That made it a capital offense. Michael was also charged with Lillian's murder, but he was never tried for that crime separately. The prosecution focused on the capital murder of Kleber because that carried the death penalty. The trial began in Collin County, Texas, in September 2001. The jury heard all the evidence. They saw the photographs of the crime scene. They heard from the detectives. They heard from the medical examiner. They learned about the DNA match. They heard Michael's confession on videotape. They also heard about his criminal history. The prosecution argued that Michael was a continuing danger to society. They presented evidence of his past thefts, robberies, drug use, and his juvenile record. They also brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Michael had antisocial personality disorder. This meant he did not care about other people and was likely to commit more violent acts in the future. The psychiatrist also described him as a sadistic sexual predator. The defense tried to save Michael's life. They presented evidence of his difficult upbringing. They talked about his drug addiction. They tried to show that he had mental health problems, including bipolar disorder. They called a psychiatrist, Dr. Laura Slaughter, who had treated Michael in jail. She was allowed to testify about the medications he was given, but the judge limited her testimony about his diagnosis. The defense argued that Michael deserved life in prison instead of death. They asked the jury to show mercy. The jury deliberated. On October 8, 2001, they found Michael guilty of capital murder. Then they moved to the punishment phase. The jury had to answer two special questions. The first question asked whether there was a probability that Michael would commit future acts of violence and be a continuing threat to society. The second question asked whether there were sufficient mitigating circumstances to warrant a life sentence instead of death. The jury answered the first question yes. They answered the second question no. This meant the death penalty was mandatory. On October 15, 2001, the judge officially sentenced Michael Adam Segala to death by lethal injection. After the sentence, Michael's lawyers filed many appeals. They argued that his trial was unfair. They claimed that the jury was biased by pretrial publicity. They argued that his confession was not voluntary. They said that the photographs of the crime scene were too prejudicial. They also claimed that his lawyers had not done a good job defending him. But every court rejected these arguments. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction and sentence in January 2004. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to review his case in June 2004. He filed a federal habeas corpus petition, which was denied in 2008. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals also denied his appeal in 2009. On February 22, 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court again refused to stop his execution. No more appeals were possible. On March 2, 2010, Michael Segala was executed in Huntsville, Texas. He was put to death by lethal injection at 6:20 p.m. His last meal was deep-fried burritos and chocolate pudding. His final words were spoken to the family of his victims. He said, "I would like to ask for forgiveness of the family. I have no reason for why I did it. I don't understand why I did it. I hope that you can live the rest of your lives without hate." Then the drugs were administered, and he was pronounced dead. After his death, the families of Kleber and Lillian dos Santos issued a statement. They said that justice had been done. They expressed their faith and said they believed they would see their loved ones again one day. The bodies of Kleber and Lillian were returned to Brazil, where they were buried. Michael Adam Segala was buried somewhere in Texas. The apartment where the murders took place was cleaned and rented to new tenants. The case was closed. Michael Adam Segala was executed for the murder of Kleber dos Santos, but his crimes also ended the lives of two innocent people who had traveled far from home to build a future together.